next speaker is Major Sean McClain. All right. Major Sean McClain is a thought leader on space power theory and an expert on cis-lunar space situational awareness. Major McClain is an experienced space operations officer in the orbital warfare discipline with over 13 years of Air Force service. He has a Master's of Business Administration from the American Military University and a Master's of Science in Military Operational Studies from USAF, Air Command and Staff College. His recent work on creating a framework for cis-lunar space domain awareness in 2035 is the type of long-term thinking and advocacy that perfectly represents what this conference is about. Please join me in welcoming Major Sean McClain.
All right, thanks Lila for that introduction. And just a quick disclaimer, because I am active duty, I just wanted to discuss this truly awesome topic, and thanks for including me in this lineup of speakers. I am here today in a personal capacity, hence no uniform. While I am an active duty military member, my views on this topic are my own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Air Force, Department of Defense, or US government. And I will certainly do my best to distinguish between official Space Force positions and any differences I may have if it becomes relevant during this conversation today. And again, I'm sorry I was not able to listen to all of the speakers in these first 2 days. Hopefully it'll be posted later and I can catch up, because this topic and what you are doing, I think, is truly, it will probably be looked back as being the greatest problem that we ever solved as a species, is how do we actually bootstrap ourselves off planet? So I'm very much enthusiastic about what you guys are trying to put on here. And that's why I certainly took the time to do what I can today. So I want to speak very quickly and then try to open it up to Q&A. I do have just 2 slides that I've been using for this just as a reference point for my thesis. I'm going to show you my notional SDA architecture for the cis-lunar orbital regime, and then I'll show you the final graphic that I came up with, and then I'll try to give my spiel on top of that. So this is kind of, I guess I can do it both ways. I just drafted this as I was listening, so hopefully I got all the timing right. I can give you the architecture as kind of a standing thing while I run through this. If you want to, how do I share screen, or just say I'm going to share screen?
You've got permission, Sean.
Okay, so I'm just going to post this as the reference point. Actually, no, I'm going to back up and just give the final one. Okay, so this is basically the money slide that, you know, my very long, much longer than I intended to thesis ended up figuring out. This is essentially what I was driving at. This took me 160 pages to finally get to and explain what this chart actually represents. It was the culmination of 2.5 years of research. So let me just try to back up, and I'll give you my little verbiage here, and then hopefully this will kind of explain what led to this chart. So I wrote my thesis between June, or actually first, 2 points. Did Josh Carlson and Steve Quast speak on the 7th? Have they already kind of given their thoughts? Okay, so I'm going to kind of echo some of those same things just from
Sean, sir, yep. They were speaking, but not everybody here was there on Monday or Tuesday. So
okay,
super brief.
So for those that did listen to those two, a lot of what I think in my research is along those lines. But for those who haven't, I'm just going to try to give you what my story was basically for the last 2 years, what led to this chart, which I think is the most relevant thing for this conversation today, for my piece anyway. And then I'll just take questions as far as what this is. So anyway, I wrote my thesis between June 2017 and March 2020 with then Lieutenant Colonel Peter Gerritsen serving as my advisor by correspondence. He was the lead officer in charge for the Air Command and Staff College Space Horizons Task Force. He was basically the officer in charge for the space professionals who were learning at Maxwell Air Force Base about space intermediate developmental education, how to get their master's degrees down there. I wrote my thesis while working as a requirements lead for space domain awareness in the Space Superiority Division at Headquarters Air Force Space Command in Colorado Springs. So basically, I went from an operational unit, and then I worked future acquisitions on a future program, and I was supposed to use my operational knowledge on space situational awareness, which then became space domain awareness for this new satellite program, essentially. And that basically, while I was going through this education program, was almost like the perfect in residency, non-traditional way of doing my degree, because I basically got to do a job that ended up complementing my research topic perfectly. And I don't know how often that actually happens in the military. Most people, they actually go to a school. I was doing it by correspondence, but my job just paralleled my topic so perfectly that it was almost even better in my case. So that's why it just took me longer to do all this, but it was a great opportunity, and I took full advantage of what I was doing just to kind of make sure that I could drive home the points of what a space professional interested in space domain awareness would want to know about this problem as I understood it. So that's kind of what this was. I felt like I was meeting my own customer demand, my own requirements question as I was doing the job, and I was looking at future versions of what this would look like. So during my 2-year tour at Air Force Space Command, I saw the military space community go through a fundamental transformation in its view of the space domain. If you've never been to Building 1, Headquarters Air Force Space Command, now Space Operations Command, it's a 3-story cross-shaped building with an open floor plan. It's a very warm, inviting feeling. There's a bunch of satellites hanging there. It's a great place to work. It's great. I love it. I miss it. We installed TVs there because we realized that there was so much stuff happening with all the launches and all the congressional stuff. Like we just needed a way to just have everybody watch the news because things were happening so fast that General Raymond just couldn't give us the news in real enough time. So 2 particular dates and memories stand out that I think are really worth sharing and just trying to convey what was going on in the building at the time. If you remember 6 February 2018 with the first Falcon Heavy launch, and 9 August 2018 when Vice President Pence announced the formation of the Space Force, you could hear a pin drop in the building during those 2 events. It was just, it's kind of like one of those moments where were you when Princess Diana died, where were you on September 11th? I think those 2 dates, for anyone working in Building 1, they will remember where they were, who they were watching it with, what they were talking about, just the electricity in the air with those 2 particular events. I think there were old guard people in the building that had done space a certain way, and when they saw those events, you could see and hear in their conversation afterwards, if they didn't believe that we were at a tipping point in the space domain before, they believed it after those events. They got it. So 2018, in my mind, was the tipping point for the military space community, hence the formation of the Space Force. From our perspective inside that building, we were seeing things happening that had never happened before, and we got it. We understood what was happening. So that was just a very, very interesting unique experience. I wish I could share that with everybody. It was very powerful to be in that building at that time. So I got invited to meetings where we discussed the future of space after this, using assumptions in terms that we'd never been used before. We just realized that, okay, we really have to rethink our assumptions and how we think about our domain. We have to think about it like warfighters. So we have to start thinking about it in all these other terms that all the other domains and services use. And it quickly became apparent to me that the military space community was essentially being asked to transform itself from a supporting element of the Air Force and the other terrestrial services into a consolidated space-based version of the 3 C services, the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Merchant Marines, within a span of 5 to 20 years. I intentionally left the Marines out of that list because I think the Marines will do a great job by themselves just fine if there's Space Force ships out there. I think the Marines will be just fine as a service. They do their jobs well. As far as technically, all that background to explain, I wrote about SDA for my thesis because that was what I knew, and I hadn't seen an in-depth analysis or assessment of what cis-lunar SDA might look like. It just didn't exist. The first year of my research and lit review was just figuring out how to even approach the topic, how to even approach that analysis and what eventually became the term framework. I was initially going to go with the topic of, or the title, an architecture, and then I really settled and changed it to framework because I realized nobody had a framework. I didn't have a framework, so I was going to make that framework, and then the architecture would just kind of happen later. I would just give my notional idea, and you could work with it from there. So I finally settled on the 4 layers: the physical layer, the economic layer, the political layer, and finally the national security layer. And when I looked back on it, I really felt like that was the right approach because it's consistent with the flag follows trade worldview. That is essentially why I think I ended up going with that particular flow, because it lays down the argument in a very straightforward way so that it's what you finally get to with this chart, which builds on itself at the end of each of those major sections. the reader should be able to understand and follow exactly what I'm doing as far as laying out all the pieces of what ends up being this final slide or this final figure, as far as what is available as an opportunity in space in the cislunar regime by 2035. So for the skeptics about my conclusions for the future of space, which I can certainly illustrate because again, it's all in this really long paper. My research was done completely independent of Josh Carlson. I met Josh actually over the summer online. I haven't actually met him in person yet, so I'm looking forward to that. But I think the fact that we wrote similar topics and arrived at essentially the same conclusions with the same sources is worth noting. I think that is important for people to understand that two people who have never met wrote very similar ideas with very similar conclusions, using essentially the same group of people and resources to guide their efforts. I think that's worth noting. And on top of that, my thesis also makes some of the same points that now retired Lieutenant Colonel Peter Garretson and Namrata Goswami's new book, Scramble for the Skies, make. I'm starting to read it. Their book is essentially a much more expanded, in-depth scholarly version of what I was trying to lay out for my thesis. And I wish I had their book 2 or 3 years ago as a great reference point, because that makes the case that I was trying to make in my initial arguments to do the so what of why we need to look at this as a cislunar, why we need to build a cislunar SDA architecture for the purposes of national security to ultimately support national economic and national geostrategic interests. So as a national security space professional, I think these conclusions about the future operating environment of the space domain are hard to ignore. As a self-described blue water space professional, I adhere to the flag follows trade worldview. And I think I do my job best if I can build a space industrial base that will contribute to national space power, which is why I'm here today, just trying to give my whole perspective, what this chart is, what it represents. That is the end of my canned brief. I am ready for any questions.
Thank you, Sean. Major McClain, really appreciate that. There are some questions about your chart. I'm going to take first dibs.
Should I leave it up?
Yeah, let's go ahead and leave it up because I want to kind of dig into this a little bit because this is the future, right? When we've been so day one, we had Lieutenant General Quast talk about transportation, energy, and information, right? That's the building blocks, right? We had the COO of the Space Foundation, Shelley Brunswick, talk about people and infrastructure, workforce as infrastructure, right? So that's the first part. And then Greg Autry talked yesterday about, this is where we're going. We need a killer app in low Earth orbit. So up till now, we've been really focused on from 2020 to 2035 and from ground to the moon, right? And so this image is really encapsulating all the things that will exist in that boxed environment of time and location, right? So I want to dig into this. There's one question in the chat about geo. Leo is not explicitly called out, and I'm just going to answer that by saying that geo and Leo are basically synonymous for a chart of this size and this depth. Is that fair? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I hadn't really considered Leo because I thought really, yeah, I think you framed it just right. I was trying to explain the the cis-lunar regime, and I figured anything below the geo regime, people would just assume that wasn't really the purpose of the discussion because I was focused on cis-lunar. So yeah.
Okay, cool. So near and dear to my heart, because I have a bias towards this, explain your little red dots because that is not as clear to everybody. Why are some of them circular and some of them elongated?
Yep, absolutely. So thank you. Great question, because again, this was a learning process for me. I went through several iterations of building these charts just to make it very glaringly obvious that things were not exactly the same in certain cases. So each of those 5 red dots are Lagrange points. I did as best as I could for, obviously it's not to scale, but spatially, those Lagrange points are essentially to scale relative to each other, relative to the 2 celestial bodies presented here. So you've got the 1 through 5 all in their specific named locations. Not all Lagrange points have the same applications, which is kind of one of the things that I uncovered. And either you immediately jump to that conclusion or you don't understand why and you have to prove it. And I kind of thought initially that not all of them would have the same, but then I had other people tell me certain uses that I had never thought of. So it just kind of confirmed for me that, yeah, and I guess this is also another thing I realized. This is not the final list. This is just what I came up with at the time, and it is entirely subject to change. There could be many more applications that I've never discovered. And I'm just trying to give an idea of what's possible. So the idea of the ovals versus the circles is we know that China launched their Chang'e 4. It's in L2, EML2. They use that as a halo orbit, which we haven't done before. And that was certainly a novel use of that Lagrange point to keep C2 of the far side of the moon. That was a very novel way to use a Lagrange point, which I think we will certainly mirror going forward for this system and any other system where we want to have comms on the far side of the smaller object in a Lagrange system between two celestial bodies. The EML4 and EML5 are circular because you don't really need to use them for a halo orbit, but you can certainly use the volume of space that is available within that sphere of influence, which isn't really a sphere, it's more like a kidney bean, but it's essentially going to be a station keeping place. So that's often been described as a place for a anneal cylinder or some other kind of habitat or just general storage facility. I just had the idea of using it for a sensor array because I thought it would be a great place to put a very high, large scale, kilometer scale structure that could be used for, say, planetary defense. I just thought that that would be a very novel way to use that location in addition to a propellant depot, just as some ideas. I'm sure there's more.
That's right. So you've got clocks in here. You've got Apollo, clock 2, clock 3. Go dive into that. And by the way, we have 12 minutes. We have 11 minutes just for
sure. And I will take this opportunity to correct myself. Peter Gerritsen has done a great job continuing to mentor and advise me. I am at this point kind of rescinding my title of that Apollo C-Lock. I don't think that specifically should be called the Apollo C-Lock. If I did add Leo, I think the correct Apollo C-Lock for the purposes of a historical Route 66 highway equivalent would be from Leo to the moon and back. That would be a more appropriate analogy for the Apollo C-Lock to follow the exact route that the Apollo missions flew for their profile. But this specific one, which I guess we'll just say C-Lock 1, is, I still think
first,
very relevant.
What does C-Lock stand for?
Sorry, C-Lock is, it stands for Celestial Line of Communication. Celestial Line of Commerce, in my mind, is underneath that per doctrine. A line of commerce is a variant of a line of communication. A line of communication has been used by navies for centuries just to kind of describe what profile their ships, what routes their ships follow for both trade and trade protection warships.
And what describe the three of these, right? What are you trying, what lines of communication, what lines of commerce are you trying to maintain? Who does that? Why does that happen?
So again, notionally, I could be wrong, but I think that we will use EML1 as a central node. I think there's just many uses for EML1 to the point where you're going to use that as a relay for a C-Lock between it and Earth and a C-Lock between it and the moon, just to transport physical goods and basically as a patrol route. So if you have a desire to bring something to that point, well, that's part of a C-Lock. If you have the desire to bring something, return it from that point, then you have a complete orbit essentially. And that's where the C-Lock would basically just kind of develop naturally. That would be the preferred natural route. And if we're talking, cis-lunar space traffic management, which is certainly another thing that we need to add into this conversation, there would have to be a way to just make sure that there's lanes and that certain, specific places and patterns have certain uses. And that way you can just kind of clearly articulate, I'm going to go this path with this particular payload. It's going to take me this long and I'm cleared for that because that's already pre-approved. And that's just kind of how these C-Locks, as I envision them for that particular physical flow of goods coming into existence. And the biggest one, the Apollo C-Lock or C-Lock 1, I see as kind of being its own potential use for a cislunar PNT system. So that's why I definitely think that that'll be a relevant thing, just to kind of encompass the moon and the Earth and the moon, so that you have traffic that is going, that is unmanned or manned. But if it gets lost, or if you need to find something, you'll want to have that PNT system on hand to just help geolocate if you need search and rescue. I just see that being a pretty important CLOC and orbit to help provide all those services.
And PNT stands for position, navigation, and timing. So we can
Correct. So
know
essentially
where
GPS
somebody,
for the cislunar regime.
right. So Dr. Mazurka from Poland has just asked about Aldrin cyclers. I'm assuming that we're going to talk about, you just said a second ago, crewed or uncrewed personnel within this CLOC 1. I assume that takes into account the potential for cyclers back and forth.
Yep, that would be the civil commercial ship icon right here, just to kind of represent all that is possible within this box. Again, these icons, there's no numbers attached. It's just what's possible. I did not even attempt to describe the volume of traffic involved.
No,
Really
that would be hard to do.
Yep.
So you've written, you wrote your thesis. I know, so I'm going to announce that you are working on a book with Josh Carlson to take some of those ideas and your ideas and connect them. And what, and again, full disclaimer, you're responding in your personal capacity. What would you want? What would you want for this diagram? What would it goes beyond an assignment. It goes beyond an assignment. What would you want for this diagram? How would you want it acted upon? Do you have you thought about what you want for it?
Well, I think 2 or 3 different lines of effort that I've heard described. One, conferences like this, I certainly think there needs to be a national/international dialogue about cis-lunar infrastructure development as its own large national project kind of way of talking about this. So there needs to be the technical layer, there needs to be the political layer, and there needs to be the financial layer. I think you described that earlier. And I agree with those 3 fronts, basically. So we need to have a space bank set up, the development, investment banks, those types of things. Those people need to, that community needs to get involved. We need a huge army of space lawyers to get involved to help us understand how to write all of the legal stuff to help that happen. And then we also need to make the politicians, I guess, aware of just what it is that we're talking about, because I've heard Mike Mealing tell me that Congress isn't interested, and that's fine. I mean, anyone can potentially not be interested, but I just think they may be not understanding exactly what it is we're talking about. Because if Peter Garrettson's going to do his conversation at some point, I don't know, but in his book, and certainly what I agree with, it quickly became apparent to me that I think this is why I think it's so hard, and I just don't understand why, but I can kind of understand why too. It's the scale. It's the scale of what it is that we're talking about. People don't understand concepts like, and I'll just kind of be nerdy for a second, but if something approaches infinity and you tell them that the idea of potentially infinite energy or infinite resources for all intents and purposes for your lifetime is available to the human species, and you just need to figure out how to get there and do it. Well, now you're just talking about different time horizons. You're just talking about different investment horizons. You're just talking about different scales of development. But fundamentally, you're still talking about the same activity that we have done in every other domain historically, as long as we have history about how we've settled this world. So I just think that it's really just explaining how long it's going to take, how much effort it's going to take, and having a willing community of people that are helping to crack that problem, which again, going back to my first comment, I think this is the greatest problem, the most fun problem, most challenging problem, and the most important problem, I think, for our time right now. This is it. If you're not part of this problem, You can solve other problems, but I just think this is the one that's going to make humanity expand and be much greater than it is currently.
I have a quote from Lieutenant General Quas saying that this is arguably the most important question of our time. So yeah, we're all on the same same mindset there. We're gonna kind of wrap up to the next speaker for a second. Before we go, I want to point out that we have 2 space lawyers on this call, so with international experience, so they're certainly interested in your question. And Pete, did you want to ask something?
Well, I think it's probably an appropriate public forum. You know, I think what Sean laid out here, particularly with the green line.
Let me pause for a second, just to remind everybody, Garretson was McClain's advisor at the Air University.
Yeah, and what a fabulous job Sean has done. And
Yeah.
you know, this is a beautiful graphic. You know, but really this green line, you know, that sort of traces the Lagrange points and the commerce that might flow amongst and between them. We should really call that the McClain line or the McClain torus. I think that is something that's appropriate.
Echoed, of course, I echo that. Thank you. And why? Why does a site like this, a location like this, an environment like this need a name? Why does it need a name?
You know, I think it's because, you know, in the same way that we talk, you know, because the word cis-lunar is so broad in general, it's the entire sphere, you know, that encompasses, you know, the moon, and, you know, people have different definitions, but to really sort of focus your attention in the same way that, you know, we get focused on low Earth orbit or geo as a region or as an area of responsibility. This has a wonderful specificity, you know, that, you know, where are we talking about? Where is this activity? Well, it's really within the McClain line, or the McClain torus is really sort of where we are focusing what's going on here, and why is this, where do we think a major conduit of activity is going to be?
Exactly. And I know, I've known Sean, I've known Major McClain for a long time. He will never, ever say this out loud. He is far too humble to claim it. But there's precedent for naming I will say geography, that's the wrong phrase. There's precedent for naming these sorts of conventions, correct?
There is. In fact, there's another naming convention that I believe certainly I've used, but there's what's called the Warden line, which is about 2.7 or 3 times geo, named after retired General Dr. Simon Pete Warden, where things sort of change. The dominance and the importance of the moon becomes very important, and sort of, you know, as you move out, there's geo, and then there's the Warden line, and then beyond the Warden line, there's the McClain line.
And there's, on the near side, there's the Kármán line. So there's this precedent for describing spaces. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate your insights and wisdom. We are going to shift it over to Lila. Sean, one last question: is your paper publicly available? It is. Would it be okay if we posted that on the Blue Marble Week website next to your name?
Absolutely. It's not my property. It's the Air Force's property. So
Yes, government.
Everyone has access to it. They just, as long as they know where to find it.
Okay, we'll get that posted in just a few minutes. I'll take care of that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.